In my live stream last night, I mentioned a gentleman with whom I was acquainted named Weasel. I generally select a new handle for somebody whenever I talk about them. I don't use the handle I knew them by, just to protect the guilty, essentially. I wonder if some of my bias might be leaking through just a little because I didn't like Weasel. I thought he was a weasel, basically. He was a slimy guy. I know there's no honor among thieves. You don't really expect people in prison to be honest and look out for each other. But there is a camaraderie, idea that we're all in this together, even in prison amongst inmates. And the guys that don't have that attitude, that are honestly just in it for themselves, they're disliked in general, not just by myself, but by most everybody. Weasel was Stu's cellie for at least a little while. Weasel couldn't keep a cellie. I knew him for about 2 years probably, and I think he went through 10 cellies in that time, which is a lot. Most people keep a cellie for at least 6 months at a time. To average 2 or 3 months indicates that you have a problem. His problem wasn't that he was disliked or that he was a slimy guy, though I'm sure that contributed. The actual issue people had a problem with was his pet. Weasel had a pet mouse named Mr. Jingles. I particularly liked the mouse. I particularly disliked the name. I thought it was terribly unoriginal. The issue wasn't the mouse itself. A lot of inmates have pets: lizards, insects, mice. These are very common. At Chino, they had feral cats on the yard, and some people would befriend the cats. They wouldn't quite be pets, but they were willing to be friendly if there was a bribe in it for them. Whenever I finished up my term at Chowchilla, they actually had a dog training program there on the yard. There were some inmates whose job it was to prepare dogs to be given to disabled people. That was a pretty neat thing to get to see. So having a pet wasn't enough to make it so that it was hard to keep a cellie. It was the manner in which Weasel felt that his pet, Mr. Jingles, should be treated. Mr. Jingles ran that cell. He didn't have a box or a little house that he was supposed to live in. He had free range with little strings set up so that he could go from one area to another of the cell, which is pretty cool, honestly. But it meant that whenever Weasel was introducing himself to his new cellie, he had to explain to him, and be very careful with where you step because there's a mouse that we share the cell with. And don't worry, he almost always uses his little bathroom. He doesn't generally just pee or poop on the floor. And he almost never gets into people's food. And if he does, I'll pay you back for whatever he gets into. And I think you can understand why, for most inmates, this was a deal breaker. They didn't want to live with Weasel. Thinking about mice, I always remember a study that I read whenever I was in the hole. I had nothing back in the hole one time, and the first mail that I got, or one of the first pieces of mail, was a Scientific American. And in it, there was an article about laboratory mice and a study that had been done where they were trying to determine if bare, sterile, Spartan environments impacted the mouse's mental health. You see, laboratory mice are used in all kinds of experiments. Test cosmetics, test medicine, to test even surgical procedures. In order to do this, they need first to have a baseline. They need to know what the mice act like whenever they aren't under stress. So they study mice and just see how they act. One thing they noticed is that whenever mice were held in just sterile environments where they didn't have any social stimuli, no intellectual stimuli, they went crazy, they decompensated. Believe that reading this article while housed in a cell back in the hole with bare walls while I'm supposed to be working on my rehabilitation, the irony wasn't lost on me. Weasel eventually ended up rolling up, and Mr. Jingles met a sad end, and I suppose that's prison to some degree. There's just not enough happy endings to stories to go around. Most people get a pretty crappy ending. At the time, I'd been hopeful that I could adopt Mr. Jingles. He ended up dying instead, but I remember telling my cellie Wolf, who wouldn't want a rat's mouse? That's awesome. That was the excuse, really. I was just hoping that I could get him into my cell because whenever Weasel left, his cellie was pretty upset, and I guess it ended badly for Mr. Jingles in one way or another. Whenever I eventually paroled, I had the good fortune to come home, and I got adopted by a cat. His name was Jaycat. It was pretty interesting because whenever I had went to prison, I had first, or just before I was arrested rather, met Jaycat whenever he was a kitten. No further interaction with him for the 16 and a half years I was incarcerated, but whenever I came home, for whatever reason, that cat decided that the sun rose and set at my feet. He'd follow me around the house, he'd sleep at the foot of my bed, and we became quite close. Of course, I said that I was incarcerated for over 16 years and the cat was alive the entire time, so he had very little time left in him whenever I came home. Losing him was, it was harsh. It's hard to lose a pet. I've since adopted a new cat, Lily, and of course I'm happy with her. She's been in a video or two. But it gets me thinking about pets. I usually end these videos saying something along the lines of, don't take things for granted. Stop and appreciate the good things in your life, the good people in your life. We lose the people around us so quick we don't have a chance to say goodbye. Appreciate them. Don't take them for granted. This time, and just this time, I'm going to point out the same goes for your pets, the animals that you love and that love you. I know it's not the exact same thing. They're not members of the family the same way that your brother or your son is. But it's not entirely different either. They are a member of the family. You love them. You take care of them. So don't take them for granted, because life is scary and you can lose them, and you will miss them. Thank you for listening today.